If you're still with us and you've been with us all day, thank you so much. I'm doing my best to keep us on time so that we respect your time. Our last session will be started in about 30 seconds. It's an amazing keynote that we saved for the last. We have two incredible leaders that most of you probably know. First of all, Michael Fullen. He's the former dean of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and professor emeritus of the University of Toronto. He's co-leader of the New Pedagogies for Deep Learning Global Initiative and is recognized as a worldwide authority on educational reform. He advises policymakers, and you've heard our two superintendents speak today about working with their districts. He advises local leaders and school communities in helping to achieve the moral purpose of all children's learning. He served as Premier Dalton's Special Policy Advisor in Ontario from 2003 to 2013. He received the Order of Canada, wow, in December 2012. He holds 5 honorary doctorates from universities around the world. Fullen's latest books are Coherence, Putting the Right Drivers in Action, and many of his books are with other people. I'm just not going to mention them at the moment. You can look them up. Deep Learning, Engage the World, Change the World. Dive into deep learning tools for engagement, Surreal Change, his autobiography, Core Governance, Nuance, Why Some Leaders Succeed and Others Fail, The Devil is in the Details, System Solutions for Equity, Excellence, and Well-Being. And then his last book, Spirit Work and the Science of Collaboration, he wrote with Mark Edwards, and they will be here today in our closing keynote. Fullen and his team currently work on system transformation in education in several countries globally. And you can go to his website at www.michaelfullen.ca because he is from Canada. Mark Edwards, I've known Mark for a while because his last school district is not far from where I live. He previously served as school superintendent in Danville, Virginia, and Henrico County, Virginia, where he was named the Virginia Superintendent of the Year in 2001 and the recipient of the Harold McGraw Prize in Education in 2003. Next, he served as superintendent of the Mooresville Graded School District in Mooresville, North Carolina, was named the North Carolina Superintendent of the Year, as well as the AASA National Superintendent of the Year in 2013. He received North Carolina's prestigious Order of the Longleaf Pine Award in 2013, and this award is the highest award a non-military person can receive in our state. And he received the Public School Forum of North Carolina J. Robinson Education Leadership Award in 2014. He's recognized as a pioneer in one-to-one computing and as a collaborative leader in public education. He's also served as Vice President of Harcourt Assessment, Senior Vice President at Discovery Education, CEO of Challenge U, and Dean of the College of Education at North Alabama University. He's published 4 books, Every Child, Every Day, a digital conversion model for student achievement, Thank You for Your Leadership, the Power of Distributed Leadership in a Digital Conversion Model, and co-authored The Power of Unstoppable Momentum with Michael Fullen. And their latest book is Spirit Work and the Science of Collaboration. And this highly acclaimed work was a featured keynote at AASA in February 2022. So Michael and Mark are going to have a conversation about all the things they've learned as they have traveled around the world doing their work. And I wanted to let you guys know, we've had people from 20 countries and 40 states join us today. So we have a pretty big audience as well. So Michael and Mark, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to start. Hello, everybody. I've been actually listening in since 11 o'clock. So I've got I don't know what, a landslide of impressions about this, and they're very compatible with what we want to say. And so I'm going to organize it in a context way. And then Mark and myself are going to go back and forth in relation to the 8 districts that we studied across the country. So the first thing I want to say is go back to December 2019, before COVID. And we had already concluded, and other people who were working in deep learning, like Jal Mehta and Sarah Fine, who basically the conclusion was there's a yawning gap between how schools are organized and how students like to learn. This was before COVID, a yawning gap. I can also say, and this the discussion the last few hours has confirmed this, there was also, before this new work, a yawning gap between how schools were organized and how teachers like to learn and be. So this was this was already established. They're called the grammar of schooling that's been with us for 100 or more years. And then COVID pulled the rug out from under all of this, exposed it. This is one, at least one contribution it made, which is really seeing that this was like a widespread problem. We have data from those days that show after grade 3, the interest of students start to go down until probably when you get to 11 and 12, it's about, I would say no more than 25% of students on the average were finding schooling worthwhile or clear or whatever. So that's one big thing to say. The second big thing to say is about the context today. I personally and our team, about 7 of us, do this work. We do system work and we do deep learning work, and we combine the two. Is our mantra is that 80% of our best ideas come from leading practitioners working together with them. And that's why with John Malloy, with Mark and Ramona, with Mark himself, we've been learning all the time in this. And then we capture it and redevelop it after that. But there's something to be said for today. And again, we've written about it, and we're not going to have like a long context discussion, but this part is important. Here it is. Nobody knows what the solution should look like. We have variations on the theme today. There's 2 reasons why nobody knows. One is each context is different, even in normal times, each context is different. And secondly, there's a moving target here that makes the context change all the time. One of the books I did with Joanne Quinn, the co-director of Deep Learning, as we started this work in 2015, is called Coherence. And in it, we talked about the need for coherence, as the definition was the shared depth of understanding about the nature of the work. So shared depth of understanding. And it's clear from that's you don't get that shared depth from a workshop, from a vision statement, from a policy. You can only get it one way, and that's by doing the work and sharing it and coming to discover it. So that's one thing to say. And then we call it coherence, but now we want to use it more as a verb. Coherence making would be the noun, and I guess I'd say. But there's 3 reasons why you always have to make coherence these days. One is that people are coming and going. Now they're going a lot, as you know, is another problem because of the lack of support, the lack of fulfillment. So people are coming and going. Every time somebody new comes, it's a coherence making proposition. The environment is changing. We don't have to emphasize that other than to say, when you change the environment, you change you have the opportunity, but you also have to change regardless to deal with it and make it more developmentally fixed to what needs to be done. And the third is that people have good ideas, hopefully, ideas back and forth. So for all these reasons, I want to say, first of all, that if you are not clear about what you should do or are doing right now, you are in an accurate place. Nobody should be clear. You should be developing and exposing. We saw great examples of this in the last 4 hours, that they really are developing things new in real time. And that this is, that each of these creations have to be contextually connected. That is, one of my nuance finding was that the big goal, the nuanced leaders who are most effective were experts in contextual literacy, was the phrase we coined. Contextual literacy is knowledge about the environment that you're in. And this is a moving target right now. So you always have to be on top of that development. So there's a number of, I think, reasons for those developments. It's not all doom and gloom. I wrote an op-ed for Ed Week. It's also on our website for New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. We released it February 24th, and it's called 6 Reasons for Being Optimistic About Learning in 2022 and onward. I could have written one, actually, 6 Reasons for Being Pessimistic, but being both an optimistic person and also linked in with the schools and systems you've heard described in the last few hours, there is reasons for optimism. And I'd invite you to go and look at that op-ed. It's only a couple of pages long. There's 6 of them, and select any 2 or 3 of those and brainstorm around it. Are those reasons? How do you make them positive in your situation? So that's really kind of leading up to what we did. Mark came to me with his idea a couple of years ago and said there are some districts around the country, quite a few actually, that are doing fantastic things, and they're distinctive from each other, but they're not working together necessarily, but they all seem to be on the same track. And we ended up calling it spirit work, which I'll mention something about that in a moment, and the science of collaboration. And so we decided that this should be captured. And so we set out to do that. Then COVID came along, so we ended up doing this, most of the pulling together of this during COVID. So this is why we see it as such a moving target. But if you think about what was happening in this, we had all of the things I said December 2019, it wasn't working anyways. And now on top of that, we have galloping inequality. It's been going on for 50 years. The data are pretty clear, gap, economically in society. Along with that galloping inequality is declining social trust. Trust is at a all-time bottoming out almost. The book Upswing that Robert Putnam did last year, which traced he called it the I-ness and the we-ness of society for the last really 110 years or so. And in that, they showed at certain periods, there was more of a sense of communal we-ness in the country. His data was around the US. And then there was periods of then that, especially the latter period, the last 40 years, became very strong individualism and a reduction of social trust. We also know about the pressing issues of climate change. So I want to say these two things by context. One is that climate deterioration and social deterioration feed on each other. The worse each one gets back and forth, I think the better they'll build together. It's very much in the content of education, our 6 C's, our pedagogical developments, the project-based learning. All of those are about changing the social and physical future of humankind. And this is why we ended up in our book calling it spirit work. And I think that this is not going to be about this and that project about project-based learning, although we'll give you some illustrations as we go through it. But what it is about is, I want you to think this time, we're talking about systems. Now, implied in what we heard, Fort Wayne is a system, it's a district. So by system, I want to say the minimum size is the district and all of its schools, not a few of its schools, but all of its schools. So in our current work now, that I'll say a little bit about as we go, we do the district work. We're working with a couple of the districts you saw in the last presentations, but we also are working with thinking about what should be the next level of the system. That is, what about the state level? And how do we, if you just simplify it, local is school and community, middle is districts, and then beyond that is the state and or federal level. So the solution has to be system change. And this is why we push, we don't like ad hoc PBLs. They have to be a part and parcel of a system working on that, learning from each other within the system, learning across systems. So it becomes that a bigger picture, because if you don't change the system, you won't be able to either start this or you certainly won't be able to continue it. And our model of system change is very much bottom up, school to district, district to state. It's the push upward. And I want to say about the presentations we heard today, I would say there's without doubt in those cases has been an increase in the systemness mindset. It's not a real word, but I'm going to call it a real word. Systemness is the degree to which people working at different levels are aware of the systems and trying to change the systems, not only locally, but the other things that juxtapose against them upward or laterally. So these are, for me, exciting times, and that's why I wrote the 6 reasons to be optimistic, because when we put those together, we can get real change from that work. So I'm being optimistic now because of the things we heard today. These are not isolated. They're still in the minority, but they're growing in interest. The question now is how to make them grow rapidly, how to make them learn from each other, how to make them effective. So I'm going to turn it to Mark to tell us a little bit about where the spirit work came our relationship to Meg Wheatley and how we got it shaped. And then we'll go back and forth around the actual cases we have. So Mark, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And it's great to be with you today. And I want to thank Define Learning and Cindy Moss, Andy Schaefer, and the whole team. It's certainly an exciting time. And I also want to share that I believe more than ever that we need each other. There's a tremendous need, a sense of great despair around the country for a variety of reasons, but we need each other. And as Michael and I were talking about working on spirit work and the science of collaboration, and as we talked about our interactions with superintendents and leaders around the country, we saw and understood a great need for a sense of spirit and not culture per se, something deeper, something really bigger. And it's basically the essence of life. And whether it's students, teachers, principals, communities, all in search and need for nurturance. And as we started talking about spirit work and the basic foundations of it, we knew that faith and trust and love and hope and coherence and consistency and conversations. You know, one of the learning that I remember a few years ago in a middle school classroom in Mooresville, North Carolina, students were having morning exercises, and they were sharing stories with each other. And I remember thinking how important that was. And somebody said something about, well, we need to get back to the main thing. And somebody said, well, this is the main thing. And I think that as we started talking about spirit work and the science of collaboration, we grew in that. And Margaret Wheatley has been a big influence on Michael, big influence on me. And a lot of her work has been around understanding spirit and community. She uses the term Ubuntu, which came from her work in Africa, which basically means we only exist through the eyes of others. We don't exist by ourselves, only through the eyes of others. So from that conversation, we started talking about spirit work and what it could mean, influencing, and then we went into the science of collaboration and a lot of the work that Michael has done around deep learning. So I'll flip it back to Michael, and then we'll take a run around the country with the districts and talk about their examples and how powerful they are. And you know, when Michael talked about, you know, we can be filled with hope, well, we can, whether we're hearing from John Malloy or whether we're hearing from Mark Daniels, there's hope, and we have to hold each other. And I want to say this to every educator, every person on this event this afternoon: thank you for your leadership. Thank you for what you do. And we need to say that more often to each other and to all the people that we are working with and know. Children need to hear it. Adults need to hear it. And when we all hear it, we're all lifted. And if we're all lifted, we'll all be in a better place. So Michael, let me flip it back to you now.
Okay, so I want to thank the 8 districts for, even though they didn't use the concept spirit work, it really jumped out at us because we were coming partly from that realization that this is more than moral purpose, which we used to say, raise the bar, close the gap. It's more fundamental. And perhaps it's the state of the world that accelerates this, but there's no doubt now that the biggest role for learning, well-being and learning is in the saving and development of humanity. You can't put it any other way. It's that fundamental. And that's where this, if it was ever an uplifting role for learning and education, that it's got to be right now, because this is really, there's so much at stake. And what we saw in the spirit work is the love and the trust and people stated unabashedly all the time, because they were doing it, students and parents and community, even though there, as we'll hear, there's some conflicts, they tended to handle conflicts with greater courage, greater transparency, as you'll see through this. So I think we have the spirit work, and now I'm going to say this is the concept for the future, for the present and the future. I'm doing some leadership work with various groups, and what they love to conclude is leadership is spirit work. That's what, in education, they're saying that. And then I'll just touch base with collaboration. Meg and her Wheatley in her foreword to our book, she said, well, actually, there's no difference between spirit work and collaboration, because collaboration is about humanity. You can't define yourself very well outside of this relationship to other humans. So she said that she fuses them. She doesn't want to think of them as two separate things. And in fact, they are fused in the book. Collaboration, if we want to stop on that for a moment. I've been involved in with Andy Hargraves and others probably for 30, 40 years. We have studied and developed collaboration along the way. And I think our conclusion is pretty clear and maybe a little bit surprising, because it says collaboration is not the answer by itself. You can collaborate to do nothing. You can collaborate to do the wrong thing. You can collaborate and get further confused. There's a lot of reasons why collaboration, if it's not moored or anchored in the guidance of spirit work, it's not going to be effective. So think of collaboration and science work as going together so much that they are a single concept that's powerfully the engine to make the changes that we're talking about, and that these changes are being discovered. And the way to discover them is to have the right orientation to start with, and then to learn from yourselves, from others by doing this. The biggest thing about collaboration, I think, that I concluded was every example of success in complexity was driven by a phrase I used, joint determination. Joint determination between whoever was leading it and whoever was part of the development of it, including students, especially more lately, we are thinking of students as the key change agents eventually. But this kind of joint determination is a better definition of collaboration. And we're going to now visit, we'll look at 2 schools. Mark will start, I'll look at a couple. We'll go back and forth with the 8 schools, then we'll draw some conclusions and open it up to questions. So Mark, can you start us into the school territory?
Sure, Michael, thanks a lot. And I think Cindy is going to post we're going to put up a photograph so you can take a look at the superintendents from the 8 different districts. I'll go ahead as that's coming up and start. Here we go. You can see Dr. Susan Enfield from Highline, Washington, and Louvel Brown from Ithaca City, John Malloy, which we heard from earlier, San Ramon Valley, Dr. Aaron Spence from Virginia Beach Schools, Dr. Marty Polio from Jefferson County, Kentucky, Dr. Francisco Escobedo from Chula Vista Elementary School District, Dr. Lynn Moody from Rowan Salisbury, and Dr. Joris Ray from Memphis Shelby County Schools. A wonderful group of leaders. And I'll start off talking about Louvel Brown. Now I'll share with you, I've known Louvel for a long time. He has served in Ithaca, New York for about a little over 10, 11 years. And, you know, somebody was asking me the other day, they said, well, Mark, what's spirit work about? And I don't know why. I said, well, it's a love story. And they said, oh yeah. I said, it really is. It's a story about how district leaders and districts have shared love in very specific ways that translate to spirit. That's made a huge difference. Now, when Louvel started in Ithaca, one of the first things he saw was a need for communication and lots of conversations. And he proceeded to have conversations with as many district staff as possible and built that sense of trust, communication, love. One of the things he did early on, he wanted the districts to be home to students. And he did something that sounds simple, but it's very powerful. They put photographs up of all the students in the schools so that when the students walk around the halls, they see themselves. They say, this is my school, this is my home, with that sense of spirit and love. Now, Louvel talks about love. He's written a book about love, but he also talks about trust and conversations. And throughout his work, he has constantly engaged with students and teachers. Now, one story coming from Ithaca that I thought was particularly powerful, a few years ago, that with Louvel and the school board, they implemented a new policy which required students who were receiving special needs services to be part of their IEP planning committee, not an associate member, but a voting member of the committee. And they went through that process, and a young lady who was 12 or 14, went through the process. And after it was over, they said, well, what did you think about, being a voting member of your IEP committee? And she said, well, I kept thinking about all the times I wasn't before now, and I should have been. And it was a powerful message for everyone. And one of the things that Dr. Brown has done constantly is promoted this sense of active listening to students and staff. Now we'll shift from New York and we'll take a quick run down to North Carolina to Rowan Salisbury and Lynn Moody. Now Lynn retired a few months ago, but one of the things that in learning from all the districts, as Michael and I were working with the districts, just the constant challenge and stress on every one of the leaders and leaders all around the country, and yet they stand up and stand tall through it. Now, Lynn served as superintendent at Rowan Salisbury near Charlotte. Cindy's very familiar. In fact, Cindy Moss is a Salisbury girl, grew up in that area, but it's a district with a lot of challenges. Lynn led the district for several years, but she focused on learning and focused on collaboration. She also focused on a sense of expectations for students, this sense that we can do things together, and really invested. And in our book, we talk a lot about the investments made in teachers' growth and learning for collaboration, understanding that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy, just like all the participants today, to taking the time and energy to grow and learn and invest yourself in your own growth. Well, Lynn did a lot of that. There was a lot of effort and talk about it. But one of the stories that I love coming from Rowan Salisbury, a student who had struggled through school, but with a lot of support. And one of the things that Rowan Salisbury has done, there's this constant sense of efficacy for all children. And a young man who had struggled and had been in a work study program, but eventually he did graduate. And part of the reason he had been involved was that he had a lot of support. He did a work study with custodians and maintenance staff, and they supported him. And after he graduated, he ended up getting hired by the district as a custodian, went to work. Dr. Moody knew him as a student, invited him to be on an advisory panel. And one of the first things at their first meeting that he brought up, he said, we need some better shoes and we need shirts with our names on it. Now that may sound, well, what does that have to do with spirit or collaboration? Well, what it has to do with, that's exactly what they did. They heard the message, they understood the need, and then they provided the support for not just this individual, but for all the custodians and maintenance workers. One of the things that's important as we build spirit culture, it's important to remember about 50% of the employees of every district in the US and around the world are not instructional employees, but support employees. So understanding the nurturance for everyone is important, just like this young man did. Now I'm going to flip it back to Michael, and we'll move on to a couple other large districts, but they have done some great work.
Yeah, we can keep track a little bit of the number of schools, the two districts that Mark just talked about, 12 schools in the case of Ithaca, 37 in the case of the last one he spoke about. So we're now going to switch to Virginia Beach, 86 schools, and then over to Jefferson County and Louisville, which has 150 schools. So Virginia Beach, what we see in this every time, and I was, I guess as a researcher, I wasn't prepared to see the ubiquity of people saying, we love and care for these students. I would have seen it in vision statements and things like that, but it always struck me as questionable as to how deep it was. But what we really discovered, it was deep in these 8 cases, and we didn't carefully, we selected them because of the reputation, but the depth we found, the consistency blew me away, because you couldn't make it up. You had to be spontaneous about it. So what we see in Virginia Beach, and it really also it confirmed one of the hypotheses we were developing from COVID more generally, and that hypothesis was those school districts that had their act together before COVID did the best in coping with it, because they had the capacity to collaborate. They had the overarching values to go with. They were already attuned to well-being. They linked it to learning. And this is what we saw just spontaneously, because we were there just as COVID started, and then kept getting deeper and deeper as we looked at this. So you see in Virginia Beach that the tremendous, there were periods where, first of all, they had a core group that did a lot of development. They expanded the participation of making decisions during COVID. They had lots of Zoom meetings, some of the person to person. They met more and more frequently. They were constantly, if you talk about coherence, when dynamic change is happening a mile a minute, you have to be on top of it a mile a minute. And that's what we saw in that kind of development. And they each of these, and this is a key to system change, there are 3 or 4 core values. I'll give you another example from Louisville in a minute. 3 or 4 core values that say we love and care for students daily. We make decisions together. We see them develop together. So these core values were already there in these cases. When COVID required them, demanded them, the districts that didn't have that preparation in their natural culture, they were the ones that had the most destructive responses or experiences with COVID. So we see in Virginia Beach the explicit goals that Aaron Spence identified about caring for every student, about looking after the needs, about the mobilization of everybody to play a role. The larger district, now Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County, it had 150 schools, they had, Marty was a high school principal, Marty Polio, the superintendent. And at the time, he was a high school principal, 2017, 2018. The state was increasingly finding the performance of the Jefferson County unacceptable, and they were moving closer and closer to taking over the district. And the board at the 11th hour almost appointed Marty as superintendent, one of the high school principals. He obviously knew the system, but we called him in the book the surprise appointment, because who would have expected among all this turmoil that as a high school principal would be not only selected, one could imagine that part, but to be so successful. And what he observed from day one, he said, he told his principals and others, we have 150 independent contractors. In other words, we've got this combination of autonomous, and they're left on their own. They don't connect sideways, but they also don't connect to the district. And so he was faced with, what do I do about this? He said, we are going to change this culture, and we're going to do it jointly. Remember my joint determination. We're going to together. And how do you change something jointly that big? You have to do it by really participating in that, but you have to start with a small number of goals, not a whole, not a big vision statement. Big mistake if you do the vision plan and have it on 20 pages and try to do it all. And so he again came up with it through a combination. He said, we're going to have as our core 3, we're going to have very close positive relationships. We're going to work on positivity. I'm going to lead the charge. I want you to be part of that. Positivity. That's going to be our one calling card. Second is we're going to focus on racial equality. Massive problem. This is going to be a priority for that. So positive plus equality. The third one, and this was a surprise to me, I'm going to say, because it was ahead of its time, it's deep learning. He said, we're also going to have to figure out how to assess schools, what to focus on for school and student skills. He did say in the interview I did with him, he said this way, he said, I did my doctoral dissertation on the student assessment and accountability. And my conclusion, I don't know whether he put this in his dissertation, but he sort of said it to me. My conclusion was that standardized tests and No Child Left Behind and the combinations of everything that came with that was the worst thing that ever happened to American education. So what they did instead was create a backpack of skills, they called, that was the formal language, but they were really a version of the 6 C's: innovation, communication, critical thinking, and that they began to redevelop the curriculum around those themes. And then they, in the portrait of a graduate sense, or at least interim, in grades 5, 8, and 11, students presented their performance in relation to the backpack, a subset of skills, to a group of teachers, 3 or 4 teachers as a panel. So they built that, they changed the culture. What's significant about this is they did that without getting permission. We say, for example, about downward policy, we want the policymakers, we want the policymakers to like what you're doing, but not to run it. So to those who say we can't innovate when we have a structured system, It's not right. They did innovate, and the reason they got away with it was that it worked. So what you get from that, to me, you get professional power. We are doing this different teaching. Everybody's happier. The parents are hearing this. The students are. The teachers. The morale is going up. So that's one thing that you get to see happen. And then you begin to in addition to this professional power, I'm going to say you get political power, because if it's working, you've got a collective power with the parents, with the community, with the staff, and everybody else. So all of these 8, I'm going to say, were powerful. They became powerful, regardless of the policy. They became powerful because it was working, because they were working together, because they could be articulate and accurate about the findings that were developed. So there's a school district, Jefferson County, that was ahead of the curve on deep learning. Maybe they didn't know it in that same language, but they definitely were, and that saved them, because they become, and we have the data in each of the cases, the 8 cases in the book. We have a couple of case studies for each chapter. The data show the impact on learning, on morale, on positivity, a lot of success. And this was under the most difficult circumstances, all during COVID, that this happened. At the end, we'll say about what should be the next steps beyond 2022. But back to you, Mark, for a couple more districts.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Now, it's interesting. Jefferson County, Louisville, Kentucky, is a large district, and that general area of Louisville, Memphis are both called Mid-South. And the next district we'll go to is Memphis, Shelby County, and Dr. Joris Ray. And this is a very large district like Jefferson County, well over 100,000 students. I think Memphis is the 21st largest district in the nation, and Jefferson County is 28. So whether you're a district of 8,000, 28, 38, or 108, we saw exemplars of leadership, of both collaboration and spirit within all the districts, that we can draw a sense of hope. And we need that for each other. And one of the things, as we were talking to each one of the superintendents in Spirit Work and other superintendents around the country, there is just, again, this need to be lifted, and a lot of what I would call just really, really hard work. But, we were on a call the other day, and Dr. Polio said, we have to stand up and lead. And that's exactly what Dr. Ray did in Memphis. Now, both of these districts, when COVID broke out, they, just like districts around the country, they immediately started deploying thousands of devices to children, and both did very successful jobs. Now, in Memphis, one of the things I admire so much about Dr. Ray, now he's a homegrown, grew up in the district, was a student in the district, a teacher, principal, moved up through the district. He's been there his entire career. But one of the things in our early conversations, he said, we have to lead with love, and not hesitating at all. We have to lead with love. And he said, our students are under so much duress and stress and are having such a hard time. They need to be loved first. And that's exactly what Dr. Ray led in Memphis, this sense of taking care of our children, taking care of our families. I was so impressed. Michael and I have talked about this several times, how much effort went on in Memphis, Shelby County to reach families, not just students, and to provide all kinds of resources throughout all of the COVID, the year and a half, and then dealing with other incredible stressful things. And yet there's this sense, a constant sense of leadership team in Memphis, Shelby County, and we can do this. Now, one of the things, I think a story that's very powerful, I grew up in Tennessee, so I'm very familiar with Memphis, and it's a sports city. It's actually football and basketball, but a basketball hotbed. And back during the heat of COVID, there was a question whether Memphis, Shelby County would be able to have sports, and they debated it, and they were listening to all of the data and the scientists and the health officials. And ultimately, Dr. Ray called a press conference and made the announcement that they would not be having sports that year in Memphis. And this was a unbelievably tense and tough time. And Dr. Ray said, no one loves Memphis sports more than I do, but I love Memphis athletes more. I love Memphis students more. And ultimately what he had to say is, we're going to put students first. And the community, there was a lot of angst, but they knew he was speaking from his heart. They knew he was leading with that spirit, and they embraced him. Now, later on, at a later time in the year, they had been in the process of deploying devices to all the students and making sure they had home connections, and making sure students and families had meals, and all of these things that you'd say is that related to the curriculum? Well, it was the curriculum that was needed in Shelby County, in Memphis at the time. But at another time, and again, this is why, I'll have to say we find hope in each of these leaders, because they show the definition of what it means to lead, and lead with spirit and hope and grace. And there was a meeting, it was a big public meeting. One of the things Dr. Ray has done, when you talk about the science of collaboration, when they were making decisions about buying over 100,000 laptops and deploying them, and all of the associated cost and needs, he drew on a large community of leaders, business leaders, community leaders, school leaders, elected leaders, to help make this decision, so that it really was a collaborative decision. They worked on it for months. They thrashed around, they pushed through it. They were trying to get it done to go for a vote. And one of the elected leaders, who was not in favor of moving forward the way the most were, said to Dr. Ray, "Are you willing to put your job on the line to get devices for every student?" And Dr. Ray calmly and with focus said, I put my job on the line for every one of these students every single day. And that is what I do." And the message was resolute, and it was clear. And again, I think that through learning about each one of the districts and the different stories and the work and the effort and the energy, you put it together, and there is that sense. And that's one reason Michael could write 6 reasons to be optimistic, because you can have this sense, yes, we can, with leadership like this, we can move forward. So Michael, I'll flip it back to you now. No, wait, before I flip back, I'm going to talk about one other leader. I'm going to take a swing out to the West Coast in Seattle, Washington. And I've known Dr. Susan Enfield for quite a while, and she's a phenomenal leader and has been recognized recently as the Washington State Superintendent, just like Dr. Polio was also recognized this year as the Kentucky State Superintendent of the Year. But Dr. Enfield has been in the Highline District for 8 or 9 years. And one of the things that I love about the Highline District is the Highline Promise. And when I was first talking to Susan, one of the things that she said, "You've got to hear about the Highline Promise." And I said, "What is it?" She said, "It's real simple. We promise to know every student by name." Now, this is a fairly large district, 25,000 students or so, but know every student by name, know every student by strength, and every student by need. Now, think how powerful, how simple, but how powerful that a district would say, this is a commitment we make to every family and every student. And it was real serious. And Susan said, there were ups and downs responding to it, but ultimately she asked every employee, "I'm asking you to join in, to be a part of this." And over time, they did. They became part of this Highline Promise that is really part of the culture of the community and part of the spirit of the community. Now, one of the stories that, as we were working on this, and all kinds of great work going on in Highline, but one that Susan shared that I thought was so powerful, she talked about visiting an elementary school, and she was walking to classrooms with the principal, and they walked into one class, and they noticed one little girl had her head down and was asleep during the class. And a little bit later on, the principal and Susan asked to talk to the girl, and they stepped outside and talked to her to see if she was okay. And she said yes. And she said that she was living in a home with a lot of people, and that sometimes she didn't sleep as well. And as time went on, Susan got to know the little girl and stayed in touch with her. In fact, she went out to have lunch with her. And Susan asked her one time, what's one of your favorite things? And she said, "Chicken teriyaki is one of my favorite things." So the next time that Susan went out to have lunch with her, she brought some chicken teriyaki. Now, a few months passed. This was last spring. And Susan talked to the principal, and the principal said, "We've lost touch with this little girl. They've moved, they're gone. we can't find him. And Susan said, we'll track them down. We've got you. We need you to find, we've got to find out how they're doing, what's going on. So the principal did good work and found the student. She contacted Susan. They had moved out of the district. And Susan, they found out where. So Susan and the principal gathered supplies, clothing, toiletries, food, lots of stuff. And they were living, several family members were living in one hotel room in a town nearby. And Susan and the principal went to see the family. They distributed the clothes and other things, and they all brought chicken teriyaki for everyone. And Susan said, as they left that day, the little girl smiled at her and said, "Isn't this just a great day? Isn't this just a great day?" And I think, again, when we see examples of that spirit, that sense of collaboration, that is happening all over this country in classrooms, and we need to talk about it and share it, just like we've heard throughout the day today, because that is that type of spirit infusion that lifts us up. And I'm going to flip it back to Michael, and he's going to talk about a couple other great leaders out on the West Coast.
So we're just going to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes and hope to get some questions and able to follow the chat anyways afterwards. There's a couple of things from a change point of view I want to mention. One has to do with what we call specificity without imposition. Sometimes I call it precision without prescription. So you'll notice the change stories at each case. These are all successful. Is that highly specific change was accomplished and none of it was imposed. It was cultivated. It was shaped. It became the internalized and highly specific. That's how you know it's there. That's how you make it effective, because to be specific. Whereas if you just say, well, love counts, it's going to count everywhere, it's too diffuse. You have to operationalize it. You have to actually do it in a way that's part of the sequence of combination to get things done. The other concept that's very interesting, because I see a lot of cases, is the role of courage. I used to think that people have, they have courage, they grow up and they say, I want to make a big impact, and they go in there courageously and do it. But it's strange in some ways that a lot of the leaders are humble, but they're so committed that as they get into deeper and deeper, they end up, and I'm going to put it this way, they end up doing courageous things that I'm going to say they wouldn't have predicted they were able to do, but they grew to courage because the stakes were so high, because they were so invested. And then I think they could be courageous the next time. So their courage is a variable. And it's just talk until you actually have it. And I don't think people go around right and left saying, I'm really courageous, watch out for me. They actually do the things that count. And the byproduct is courageous leadership that makes a difference. And then they are still humble, going to do more. So I'm just going to touch base very briefly with the final two on the West. One of them is John Malloy. So you heard him for that hour earlier. Fantastic, really interesting case. Aside from the size problem, remember he said, because I studied him in Toronto where I'm based, he went from a school district of 600 schools to one of about 30 schools. And he arrived just at the early stages of COVID. So he's only been there during COVID. But he also, and this came through, because this is a really subtle change accomplishment. This was a district, is a district that was highly satisfied with his academic reputation. Most of the kids went to post-secondary in the right way, that from their point of view. There was a lot of parents that were high expectations that were met, et cetera. And basically, John had a discussion with them over, it doesn't take long to, we have a go slow to go fast is the change guideline here. You have to go slow to really size it up, make some relationships. But once you start going, it accelerates because it's social contagion. And what he was able to do, because they did it collectively, was to have them realize before it would be imposed on them that academic success was not going to be sufficient in the ages that we're in. That will lose its cachet. It will lose its position. In fact, we have a finding or a saying that good at learning, good at life, and you could really be good at education but still not be very successful in life. I think he put that slide up. And so in that case, it's like one of the books I read called them the wounded winners. They were good and they won the academic game, but they weren't better off in society that had a lot of other problems that they couldn't cope with in their own lives. The final one was Chula Vista, one of the 42 districts in San Diego County. And we're actually working in that county right now. I'll just tell you the short story. Do read the case of Chula Vista, because what they did, big district, is that they built up family centers in relation to clusters of schools, and were able to deal with the non-educational factors like poverty, health, safety, all kinds of things that were difficult and are difficult there, along with the academic, and through this local operationalization and development become highly successful, because they married the instructional side with the social emotional development side. In fact, the really strong development of community agencies. So that's a success. But the aspect I wanted to mention is now, as we've just formed a partnership in February for 2 years in San Diego County. It has 42 districts, and this is the goal they set. They have 500,000 students across the 42 districts, that they will reduce poverty, not just educational performance, but reduce poverty by 1/3 in the next 3 years. So they are going to mobilize the school capacity and district capacity knowledge that is accumulating, of which you heard a lot about today, and also the knowledge about what is the community schools relationship, what's the role of health and social work and all of the other agencies. How do you make it a cohesive combination and put yourself on the line to develop that? So I want to just conclude as we say that this whole afternoon, and I know people have a chance to review chunks of it or see it for the first time when it's disseminated by Defined Learning, which is a great service. So last point to make is, this is totally precarious. From this moment on, for the next 24 months or more, but let's take 24, the world and the school systems and everything about it, you know this more than I do, that there are more reasons in some ways to leave the profession than there are to stay because of the circumstances of it. So the turning point that we want to say from the kind of work that was described today is, this better be a fork in the road. This better be leading to the multiplication of things we've heard today over the next 24 months, or all will be lost. And I do mean a lot will be lost. So thank you. Over for a few questions we have, and certainly follow up. We're happy to do that.
Wow. Thank you guys so much. That was inspiring in many ways and gives us hope for the future. I was wondering, in my local city where I live, they just fired the superintendent. And moving forward over the next 2 years, as we face these precarious times, school districts and school boards are having to hire superintendents. You have these leaders that have been courageous, not comfortable, done amazing things. How can school boards find people that have the qualities that will allow them to be courageous leaders, and how do they need to support them moving forward?
Mark, why don't you start?
Okay, well, Cindy, it's a long story, but I think that the key thing is for school boards to focus on finding leaders who represent the values that they want to have in the district, and those leaders are there. Now, one of the things that, as we were working on this book, and Corwin is our publisher along with AASA. And one of the things, when Michael and I were doing the Keynote AASA this year, we learned that almost 1/3 of the superintendents in the country this year have left. And that's, when you say that, you say, well, all right, well, think about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And so the time to build and make sure we have school boards that understand that the focus should be on children and lifting people up. So I think Cindy, I think that every city has to look at it, but I think the school board associations are important in building the sense of skill sets, and then school boards can learn from other school boards and learn from each other. But it's really important work. And as a good example, as we wrote this book, 2 of the superintendents retired and left, and 2 or 3 others came under tremendous attacks, threats. So you think of all of the stressors. So more than ever, I think it's important that we hold hands and stick together, that we lift each other up, and that communities say we have to find leaders who believe in public education, believe in children.
Thank
So
you
if you
so
go to the
much.
foundation, Cindy, I mentioned earlier that in the deep learning pre-findings that schools are not organized in the way that students like to learn. This is like, I'm talking a conclusion that's been made 2 or 3 years ago, covering a lot of the past. This means that schools are not organized for the way teachers don't believe. So you start to go up the hierarchy, and what makes the principal, or sorry, the superintendent vulnerable is that probably every principal like that, or sorry, every superintendent in that situation who finds it unbearable, who leaves, gets fired, it's indicative of a lot of problems all the way down from school to the top. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. And so we're really talking about the main lesson here is not to increase PBL, here and there. That's a good thing to do. It's not sufficient, but really to step back and say there has to be a lot more learning. That's take the risk of being more open for mentors for superintendents all on the way up as well as on the job. Groups coming together for combinations of things. There's got to be a more communal response now, but in the next 12 months, 24 months, everybody is vulnerable.